With us today to discuss recent events in Israel around the deportation and incarceration of African immigrants and asylum seekers is the author of that Truth Dig piece titled The Emmett Till Effect in Israel, David Sheen. David Sheen is an independent journalist and filmmaker born and raised in Canada, long living and doing on-the-ground reporting from Israel and Palestine. He's a former reporter and editor at the daily newspaper, Israeli newspaper Haaretz, known best for focusing on critical topics that the mainstream media ignores. His current written and video work focuses primarily on the country's racial and religious tensions. In 2017, Sheen was named a human rights defender by the Ireland-based Frontline Defenders. His work for Plus 972, Mondoweiss, Al Jazeera, Alternet, Electronic Intifada, and other online news sites can be read at his website, davidsheen.com. 7 years ago, David began publishing viral videos of the regular anti-refugee race rallies through the African neighbors of Tel Aviv. It is my pleasure to welcome David Sheen back to Middle East in Focus.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Good to be back. Thank you.
Well, it's always great to have you, and your work is just always stunning. Recently, you've written two very informative articles just over the past week on the topic of Israel's African refugee population. The most recent one is titled Vigilante Violence Reminds Us How Little #Black Lives Matter in Israel, which was published in Al Arabi. It includes some examples of your history of reporting on, you're reporting on the issues that African immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers face in Israel. And it includes a link to a film that you made 6 years ago with the African Refugees Development Center in Israel. I believe that film was made in connection to a report that was published for the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Is that correct?
That's right. You got it. We put that out. At that time, the Israeli government had just passed its first anti-African law, so to speak. There had already been, of course, a lot of discussion about what to do with them, but that was the first time that it had been acted into law, law that so-called sanctioned the government to start rounding up African refugees off the streets of Tel Aviv and incarcerate them for X period of time until they could be coerced to self-deport back to Africa. So when that passed in January 2012, immediately a couple weeks later, we published this report to the United Nations on Israel's war on Africans. Sadly, the Israeli, the UN acknowledged it with their own report a month later, acknowledging all these problems that we pointed to. Sadly, the Israeli government didn't do so, and we saw a very serious uptick in vigilante violence against Africans in the months that followed.
And Israel is a signatory to the 1951 UN Convention on the Status of Refugees, yet they still don't have any actionable asylum legislation, only ad hoc policies and regulations. Can you talk about Israel's reluctance to grant refugee status and how many people Israel has actually granted refugee status to?
Sure. I mean, Israel's been in existence since 1948, and up until a couple of years ago, it had granted less than 200 people in its entire history refugee status, according to government statistics. In recent years, of all the tens of thousands of African refugees that have entered Israel and have submitted refugee claims, only 10 people from Eritrea and 1 person from Sudan have received refugee status. So it's 0.0 something percentage. It's actually noted as the lowest refugee recognition rate in the world, sadly. And unfortunately, what we see now is that the Israeli government isn't even embarrassed about it. It's actually boasting about it, with Benjamin Netanyahu holding himself up as an example, saying, Europe, you're doing wrong. You should see us as the vanguard of European civilization, holding off the barbarians from Arabia and Africa. And so it's, trying to say, hey, Hungary, Austria, Poland, you need to buy our high-tech fences that we built on the African border to prevent refugees from coming. You need to adopt our anti-refugee policies. Sadly, what Israel's signature on that convention and participation in its authorship has become a sad joke, considering that it now is actually a world leader in, squelching refugee rights around the world.
Yeah, another case that you reported on, which is recounted in your Al Arabi article, is about a group of Israeli men who firebombed a nursery and multiple homes of African refugees. Can you discuss that incident and how Israeli police and other authorities handled the cases of the victims and the perpetrators of those crimes?
Sure. We can talk a little bit about that. It occurred exactly 5 years previous to Trump's visit to Israel. I remember when Trump was here a few months ago, that it kind of stood out for me. Exactly 5 years previous. What had happened was that at that point there had been an uptick of anti-African rallies, just like race rallies through the streets of Tel Aviv, where people from the neighborhoods and also Jewish West Bank settlers would come in to strengthen them, to give them to support them in their desire to rid Israel of Africans. So a combination of locals and extremists from the West Bank would come and march through these African areas of Tel Aviv, just walking up to any black person they saw, screaming at them, yelling at them, "Get out of here! You're a thief! You're a rapist! You're a murderer! Get out of our country! I don't want my daughter to date you!" Blah, 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 blah. Et cetera, et cetera. And so people already felt comfortable doing that. Israeli politicians would come down and lead these rallies. And at that point, there's, obviously accompanying street violence. That's when they're together. Occasionally, people will, just do drive by or run by or bike by attacks on Africans in the streets. And what you had that night was, taking it to that level of actually creating firebombs, Molotov cocktails, and going around the streets of South Tel Aviv and firebombing the homes of African folks, and even one that was used as a nursery for little African refugee kids. Afterwards, in the wake of this, first of all, that next day the police didn't, we wouldn't have even known about it if it was that we were going into African neighborhoods and learning from the people themselves, because Israeli police felt that it was so important that it didn't even require them to release a statement about it. And in any case, the person was eventually found because he's so stupid. He ends up continuing going to these anti-African rallies, and screaming and yelling at people. So eventually, he's caught, but he gets off with 0 jail time for the crime. And this is, a pattern that we see over the years, that what happens is, it happens in the case of Palestinians, of course, both West Bank Palestinians and Palestinian citizens of Israel, that, there's 2 very different systems of justice. But, here we now see, as the violence steps up against Africa, after this other group of non-Jews in the country, African refugees, we see that once again the courts of, the slightest slaps on the wrist to those who, use lethal violence against African people, yet that the Africans themselves then are doubly victimized by the state. So in the case of the kindergarten, the African kindergarten, as I mentioned, the dude who did it, he got off with just, community service, so-called. But the couple that ran the kindergarten for African kids, the man was, within a few months, kicked out of the country, forced back to Africa. And ever since, the government has cracked down on this. They've had to move from place to place, because wherever they go, local Israelis will target it. And, this is what happens to African kindergartens in Tel Aviv. They get, dead animals thrown into their yards, feces thrown into their yards, garbage thrown into their yard. People don't even see the fact that this is a space for children as making it sacrosanct. In their mind, the children of African people are also fair game in their war to kick them all out of the country.
This is Middle East in Focus on KPFK. We are discussing the treatment of African immigrants and asylum seekers that led to the recent Israeli government issuing notices to thousands of African refugees and migrant workers, advising them to leave the country or face imprisonment. We're talking to journalist and filmmaker David Sheen, who has been reporting on these issues for several years now. David, another piece that you wrote, read widely in the U.S. that I referred to in the opening, is the Truthdig article titled "The Emmett Till Effect in Israel," and it draws a bold comparison between the recent conviction of 2 Israelis for brutally beating to death an African refugee with the famous, or I should say infamous, 1955 murder and mutilation of Chicago teenager Emmett Till. Can you discuss the murder of Babakir Ali Adham Abdo and the similarities to the Emmett Till case?
Sure. I guess just put it out there, trigger warning. It's both stories are horrific. They're horrific to hear. They're horrific to tell. And, of course, they're horrific to have happened. Of course, in the case of Emmett Till, very briefly, he's a Chicago teenager visiting family in Mississippi. He is lynched. A group of white folk beat him to death and beat him so badly, in fact, pummeled his face so badly into mush that his face is not even recognizable as a human face afterwards. It just looks like a sack of potatoes. Of course, his family is traumatized by this, and his mother famously insists on it being an open casket so people will see how vicious white supremacists are. And at that time, it was, racists justify saying, Till deserved what he got because they claimed that, moments before they murdered him, he had so-called flirted with a white woman. How dare a black man flirt with a white woman? So that was justification. Of course, years later, turns out that the woman had actually manufactured the entire claim. There was no basis to it. She just made it up altogether to justify, as, shouldn't be surprised. So this whole idea, this anti-miscegenation sentiment that racists are they're so grossed out, they so despise race mixing, so-called, romantic relationships between black folks and white folks. So it's easy for them to believe such an accusation. Of course, me too. We want to believe every single woman, but sadly, this, intersects with white supremacy, and in the case of Emmett Till, led to the brutal murder and mutilation of a young black man, just because he was black. And that's pretty much the exact same thing that happened to this African refugee, Babakir Ali Adham Abdo, and Petah Tikva, the sister city of Chicago, as you mentioned earlier. And what happened with him was he was actually a 40-year-old African refugee, single man. He's walking down the street right outside of City Hall. And, of course, the reason we know all this is because there's CCTV cameras at City Hall, so they actually filmed the entire thing, so it can all be seen. And what happened was at least according to the video, you see him walking down. He sees a group of young teenagers on the other side of like a bench, like a park bench and tables. He starts talking to them. After just less than 10 seconds, he throws up his hands like, okay, I get it. They don't want to talk to me. And he just keeps walking down the street. Seconds later, these young Israeli men pounce on him and beat him for the next hour and a half on camera. Israeli ambulance workers come, they look at him, and they leave. They're like, oh, he doesn't need any help. So then the killers come back, and they beat him some more, and some more, and some more, and some more, until, as in the case of Emmett Till, his face was so badly beaten that his own brother, could not actually identify his body to retrieve his body for burial. The only way that they were able to retrieve his body was, to identify that it was him, was because he was missing some fingers, which he had lost in the fighting in Darfur, the fighting that he had fled Sudan, and that was the reason that he had come to Israel to begin with, And so that was those missing fingers were the only way that his brother was able to recognize this badly beaten African refugee, because he was a black man. And then, of course, afterwards, he was smeared once again. His murderers and fellow racists smeared him, saying, oh, he sexually harassed these women. And, of course, once the CTV camera footage came out, we saw that literally he spoke to them for 3 seconds. There's nothing that he could have done to justify anything remotely close to that. But what we see is that in Israeli society, there is a deep hatred of miscegenation. And we don't need this example to prove it. The government openly funds anti-miscegenation groups in this country whose objective is to prevent mixed-race marriages. And some of these groups that are government-funded from several different ministries, they patrol the streets of Israeli cities across the country with the avowed objective of preventing mixed-race relationships, of enforcing, anti-miscegenation, and it's by our sensibilities, this is disgusting. It's disgusting that people should have these views, and it's doubly disgusting that the state should support these kinds of groups in any way, shape, or form. But that's the reality. We have groups, again, racist supremacists from the West Bank who colonize Israel internally. They move from their Jewish-only West Bank settlements to a neighborhood in a mixed city in Israel, so-called, because some of its population is Jewish and some of its population are Palestinian citizens of Israel. So those few cities in Israel where both of them live, these racist groups move with the help of government funds, move to those mixed cities so that they can increase Jewish supremacist sentiment in those areas and, dissuade local Jews from being friends and more with Arabs. So this has long been, part of Israeli government policy to fund these groups, and it always has been. So it's no shocker when that leads to actual murder on the basis of that hatred, or justifying, mutilation and murder on the basis of these accusations of race mixing. This is the reality in Israel today, and so it's not. With all of the racism going on in the U.S., and I don't mean for 1 second to detract from the level of anti-blackness in the United States, certainly not in the Trump era and also beforehand. But the level of anti-blackness in Israel, the level of racism in Israel is just, it's on crack, it's on speed, it's just, I kind of lack superlatives to describe it, but the point is, in 2018, we're experiencing what y'all experiencing in 1955.
Right.
So that gives you a sense of how badly it is for black folk in Israel today.
Your reporting has also pointed out several incidents or even ongoing regular incidents of Israeli elected officials whipping up vigilante violence and racist sentiments by accusing them of violent crimes, of anti-state terrorism, and of bringing deadly diseases to Israel. But is there any actual data to prove or to refute those claims? And what is Prime Minister Netanyahu's primary justification now for expelling or incarcerating the African refugees?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, this is the thing. From minute one, with Netanyahu coming back to power in 2009, him and his ministers and backbenchers from his party, but both political and religious leaders start inciting racism against the African refugees. Of course, they make, horrific smears against them that have literally no basis in reality, saying, as you said, they bring diseases to Israel, they bring crime to Israel, they bring this. The thing is, the Israeli government itself, there's what's called the Knesset, they actually send researchers. If a Knesset member wants to know data, then they have paid researchers who then go and collect the data to report back to the Knesset so that they can make policy decisions. And every time the Israeli government did this, they would find that no, in fact, crime statistics of African refugees are, in fact, lower by by many factors, lower than the crime rate of native Israelis. They have a lower crime rate. Of course, that isn't shocking because that's generally the case around the world. As far as I understand it, most refugees or first-generation immigrants are too fearful. They're so, afraid of not fitting in, of, not just assimilating into society, that they're extremely hesitant to commit crimes. Of course, when they do, it's survival crimes. And of course, there's examples of everything that proves the rule, but the point is, as I said, Knesset reports themselves proved that, in fact, they have lower crime rates. And this is consistently proved by police stats. So, of course, what does the Knesset do? Well, afterwards, so the researchers who bring these reports, they're eventually demoted, and fired from their government positions because, oh, no, they brought the wrong statistics. They actually show that there was no just cause for persecuting the African refugees. So this is standard operating procedure. Now, so all these things are, of course, there's no basis for. Now, what then is the real reason? Of course, the real reason, which Netanyahu is not embarrassed to say himself, he said it very explicitly. He says that their presence is a threat to Israel's Jewish character, its ethnic character. Israel, according to the vision of Benjamin Netanyahu, is a state that's Jewishness is predicated on non-Jews not being there, is what he's saying. He's saying the mere presence of these people and the fact that, half of them are Christian and for those that are religious, half of them are Christian, half of them are Muslim. So the fact that Christians and Muslims will be in the country, that we can't live with it. We can't live with the presence of non-white, non-Jews.
And this is a country that former prime ministers have claimed is the greatest, most welcoming country for immigrants, for refugees in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is, of course, it's kind of just an offshoot of Hasbara, which is Israel is the greatest democracy in the world. It is the greatest army in the world. It is the greatest everything in the world, But, of course, it's sad and sick to have to hear this. Israel is the most anti-racist country in the world. That was the claim of then President, former Prime Minister Shimon Peres
the PC.
in 2011. And of course, it's ridiculous because Israel has never, as I said, it has the lowest refugee acceptance rate in the world. Of course, it took in millions of Jewish people, but it didn't do so under refugee rules. It did so because they were the right racial group.
Right.
And at that point, Israel's immigration policy was considered, some kind of affirmative action program to help Jewish people who had just suffered through a Holocaust. So, this is a racist immigration policy, but, we need to, this is the liberal Zionist justification for it at the time. But now what we see is that it's not about giving Jewish people a place to survive. It's giving them a place to survive where they don't even have to see any Christian or Muslim people in their line of vision, apparently. Just the mere having to see black people. And this is what Israeli politicians consistently say when they come down. Every so often, every few years, an Israeli politician will come down to South Tel Aviv to tour the African neighborhoods of Tel Aviv, to walk with those very racists who lead those anti-African race rallies, to tour the neighborhoods with them and, offer their support and their justification for why the war on African refugees should continue and be stepped up. And so, this is what we've been hearing over and over and over again. Just when they come down there, they're like, I saw black people, all these black people, and I couldn't recognize Israel. It wasn't Israel anymore. Like the fact that there are, hair salons that cater to black people, the fact that there are restaurants that serve delicious Eritrean food, the fact, that there's stores that sell beautiful dress clothing from African countries. That to him, can't be Israel because there's this internalized racism that somehow, Jews, even Jews from North Africa, even ministers of government whose parents, who themselves immigrated from Africa, North Africa, come to the country and see African people and say, oh my God, it can't be Israel. Of course, Israel is in Africa. It's in Northeast Africa. It's in Asia too. And maybe some people argue it's in Europe, but it's on the border. It's on the cusp. It's African. And if it's on the border between Africa and Asia, it should be half African or a third African. Of course, it's not. And just the fact that African people live together or close to one another in a neighborhood, enough of them live together to have shops and to have restaurants and cafes, that is so offensive to Israel's political and religious leaders. And of course, they don't have to be embarrassed about it. They openly say, we see Africanness and we think that must be pushed out. And
this is,
of course, this isn't really debated in America, but this is the reality on the ground for us here.
We are hearing from Canadian-Israeli journalist and filmmaker David Sheen discussing the oppression of African immigrants and asylum seekers in Israel. In our last few minutes, David, the April 1st deadline for African immigrants and asylum seekers to self-deport, quote unquote, is coming quickly. And progressive Israelis, at least some of them, have begun to publicly oppose the impending expulsion. Can you discuss in the next 2 minutes what that has looked like in Israel in recent weeks?
Sure. So, yeah, thankfully, it's nice to see, it's kind of at the last minute, a little too late, but yeah, it's great. There's, people from all walks of life, whether it's doctors and psychologists or artists, and, Holocaust survivors, pilots, people just saying, we as people object to this, we oppose this, we want these people to remain here, their lives are in danger, they should have the right to be here. In the rest of the world, they're recognized as refugees. That's great. That's all good. We've also seen in recent weeks, finally, after years and years and years, after a third of the African refugee population has already been forced out, we see also outside of Israel, Jewish groups actually criticizing the Israeli government, a very rare example of this. Of course, sadly, a lot of this is because they're worried about Israel's image, and not because they actually care about stopping the racism, because the racism has been happening all along, and these U.S. Jewish groups, the mainstream U.S. Jewish groups, have known about it all along. And thankfully, to those people who have worked long and hard to bring this story to the media, if it wasn't for them, those U.S. Jewish groups would continue. Of course, I'm talking about the mainstream, not groups like Jewish Voice for Peace and others who have been talking about it for years, but the mainstream Jewish groups have continued to ignore the topic. So it's good that it's finally coming to the media. It kind of forces them to say something. Unfortunately, it's not doing much because the Israeli government has, recently with the rise of Trump, more so just come to the conclusion it doesn't need to cultivate relationships with liberal Zionists in the U.S., even though that's most of the American Jewish population, to have, at least to aspire to liberal values. The Israeli government doesn't share those liberal values. It says so in so many ways, and one of the main ways it's done that is by openly supporting Trump and acting as Trump's defender on the world stage for his anti-refugee policies, which Benjamin Netanyahu tweeted about, and against accusations that he himself encourages anti-Semitism by, bringing up white supremacists, under his reign. So, it's amazing that people are now talking about it, and people should be talking about it more, and not just that this is something the Israeli government is doing, but sadly that over the years they've convinced 2/3 of the Israeli population to support this proposed expulsion, according to the most recent polls. And of course, amongst Israeli Jews, it's even more so. The difference between non-Jewish and Jewish support for the expulsion is almost 20%. So the shameful support and the critiques from abroad need to be not only directed, in my humble opinion, towards the Netanyahu government, but also towards actually dealing with the widespread racism in Israeli society that has been off the table for discussion for so long, precisely because of so many of these liberal Zionist groups rallying around the flag and trying to defend the Israeli government from any accusation of state racism, even at the point that we're at now, when black people can be lynched in the streets and nothing serious be done about it.
Well, we will continue to read your work. Thank you for your just dogged reporting on this and really up close and personal accounts of this problem in Israel that, of course, we share to a large extent here in the United States. Thank you very much once again for joining us, journalist and filmmaker David Sheen.
Thanks so much for having me on. Be well. Take care.
You as well.